Well, good morning, New Vine Online. My name is DJ. I'm lead pastor at New Vine Church, and I'm coming to you live from the control room today as we await the start of our in-person service. I just wanted to welcome you. Glad you're here, whether you're a regular and you're travelling or unwell. We know we've got a number of New Viners down with COVID at the moment. Hope you're feeling okay, hope you're recovering, and hope your family is doing okay if that's you. Or if you're visiting, welcome to you especially. We're so glad that you've dropped by, that you've found us somehow, and that you have this opportunity to kind of check us out and get a bit of a flavour for who we are at New Vine. We would love to welcome you to an in-person service sometime, and particularly next Sunday on Christmas Day. If you live in the Newcastle area, then we can be found out in the leafy western suburbs in Maryland, just diagonally opposite the Fletcher Village shops. Our service next week is 9:30 a.m. like every Sunday. It'll just run for an hour, however, so short and sweet, lots of fun, lots of Christmas music, and we would love you to join us for that occasion. And this morning we continue our series called The Coming King, which is our Christmas or Advent series. We're into week 3 now, and we'll wrap that up next week on Christmas Sunday. And this week I'll be sharing on the theme of welcoming the King, looking at a passage from Matthew 2, verses 1 to 21. So if you want to grab your app or grab your old school Bible and thumb through till you find that in the New Testament, then go right ahead. Otherwise, grab a coffee or a juice or whatever beverage of choice you'd like, and sit back and enjoy. And very shortly we'll kick off down here with our in-person service. And thanks again for joining us. Bye for now. Thanks. Take a seat. Well, good morning. Looks like we are quality, not quantity this morning. So welcome all. Thanks for being here. And especially if you are visiting, let me just reiterate, we'd love to meet with you afterwards over morning tea. Thanks in advance to Kathy Bell for another fabulous Christmas-themed morning tea this morning. Thanks so much, Kathy. And even if you're new here, you've been coming for a while, but you still feel like you're connecting, getting to know people, then we'd love to welcome you to that morning tea with some of our sort of staff and leaders after the service. 1 week to go, as AJ said. Just one small thing to say, in addition to what AJ shared. Thank you, AJ, for what you shared earlier. If you are bringing a gift card this afternoon or tonight or something to donate for our Joy Tree appeal, we've got a letterbox in the wall just to the right of the exit doors as you're heading out. There's a little letterbox. Left as you're coming in. So if you've got a gift card, you can pop it in there and it'll stay secure. Then we can pick them up from there without any risk of them being snatched from the steps this afternoon or something like that. Thank you again to everyone who's been so generous in donating something to that. Thank you. And let's pray it's like the loaves and fishes, that what we've been able to gather will go forth and bring a blessing to many. Well, when my family lived in Scotland some years ago, we spent a number of Christmases here. Actually, this was a few miles up the road. We actually spent our Christmases here on one of the western islands of Scotland, the Hebridean island of Mull. We spent a few Christmases there. It was heart-achingly beautiful and bone-achingly cold. Nevertheless, on Christmas morning, we would bundle up our wee Teletubbies here. We would brave the wind and the sleet and the freezing rain and head off to a local church along with whichever friends were visiting with us at the time. And if you have kids, or you've had kids, you know how hard it is to get them out the door on a good day. And if you've had kids in a cold climate country, you'll know how much harder it is to get all those boots and beanies and mittens and coats and things on and out the door. So inevitably, we arrived at this church a little late. Not that late, just a little bit late. We finally got them in the car and down the road and out of the car again into the cold. And we were hoping that as we arrived at this church where we'd never been before, it was a bit of a gamble, with all our kids dripping wet from the rain and everything, we were hoping we could kind of make a discreet entry. That we'd find a little foyer somewhere at the back door of the church. We could take all these kind of layers of wet clothes off and find a little back pew somewhere that we could sneak into surreptitiously without disrupting too much of the proceedings. Well, that was our hope. Little did we know at this particular church, small church, stone church building, the main doors entered straight into the main room. It wasn't a particularly big room, but there was only one of them. And so we opened these big oak doors and we stepped inside. And all of a sudden, all 17 sets of eyes turned towards us. There was no hiding. We're standing in the doorway, bedraggled, dripping wet, and everyone's looking at us. What's more, not only was there not a back pew, there wasn't any pews at all. All 17 seats in the building were taken. So we're standing in the doorway, dripping wet, thinking, what do we do? Is it too late to just turn around and head off again? So we kind of muddled it through, as AJ would say. Eventually, someone found us some seats or something. Good moment. It was so awkward, think kind of Harry and Meghan turning up at Christmas lunch on Sunday at Windsor Castle next week. We felt pretty awkward. We felt pretty unwelcome, as they might too. And I think what made it worse was that when everyone looked at us, from my recollection at least, there was no smiles. There was no, hi, welcome, come on in. Now, to be fair, maybe they hadn't had many visitors in recent years. There wasn't any young families there. I think the minister was probably the youngest, and he was late 60s, I'd say. And no disrespect to those of our wonderful seniors here, but when you've got little kids and you look around, there's no seats. Everyone's looking at you with this kind of solemn expression as if you're the devil himself turned up to disrupt their solemn celebrations or something. We felt rather unwelcome. We worked it out in the end. Maybe there was a reason they hadn't had many visitors for a long time. But maybe you've experienced something similar. Somewhere where you have felt unwelcome. Somewhere you felt you didn't belong. Maybe it was among strangers like us, or maybe it was among people you thought were your friends. Maybe even among family. Maybe it was Christmas dinner. Maybe it was in your marriage. Maybe it was at church. Maybe it was this church. Whatever it was, you felt the awkwardness of unwelcome. Today we are continuing our series, our Christmas series called The Coming King, in which we've been exploring the fact that Jesus is more than a saviour to accept. He's also a king to follow. And last week, our guest speaker, Robin, talked about what we might learn from Jesus' mother Mary's experience while she was awaiting the coming of her child, born to be King of the Jews, especially from her song in Luke. And by the way, if you wanted to revisit that sermon from last week and hear what Robin shared, you could either watch it again on our YouTube online on demand channel, or you can actually find a summary of the article that she's now published in Eternity magazine, which was published on Friday online. So look it up and that'll be a refresher for you if you like. Well, today we are going to be comparing two sharply different types of welcome received by the newborn King whose birth we celebrate at Christmas. Now, if you grew up going to church, who grew up going to church? Okay, quite a few of us. Or if you've been in church for a few years, then the passage that we're going to look at today is probably pretty familiar to you. It often gets referred to this time of year. But if you're new to church or you're just visiting, then this is one of the historical records from the New Testament section of the Bible which tells of events around the birth of Jesus, a birth which itself sits at the very epicenter of history, and certainly the epicenter of the Christmas story. So, without further ado, let's pick up the story in chapter 2 of Matthew's version of the Jesus story. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, let's just start with that first bit. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. If this geography is not too familiar to you, this is Israel. You can see Jerusalem marked in the bold there. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to make out. And in the smaller writing, just below it, is Bethlehem. It's about 5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, about 8 kilometers. You can walk it. I've done it. It's walkable. And if this was a blockbuster movie, very first scene that we're seeing here unveils the setting and some of the key characters for this. Now, Bethlehem actually means house of bread. It's a city, as I say, you can still visit today. It was the birthplace of King David. And at the time of Jesus' birth, the population was probably, we don't know exactly, but it was probably less than 1,000, maybe about the same size as Minmai today, just out to the west of us here. That's before Minmai starts, open up all those new housing developments. But Matthew places the birth of Jesus as during the final years of the reign of this character called King Herod. I talked a little bit about Herod 2 weeks ago. But it can be a little bit confusing when it comes to the Herods of the Bible. There's more than one or two of them, in fact. Firstly, we have Herod the Great. Then we have his son, Herod Antipas, or Herod Antipasta, as one Sunday school kid thought it was. Herod Antipas was followed by Herod Agrippa the first. He's got a Agrippa of that. Oh no, I wrote that myself, can you tell? Yeah, actually it just came to me on the spot. I just shouldn't do that. Stick to the notes, DJ, And then he was followed by Herod Agrippa, his son, Herod Agrippa Jr., Herod Agrippa II. And that's before we even get to Herodias, who married Herod Antipas after divorcing Herod's brother Philip. And that was the episode that got John the Baptist into a whole bunch of strife. So lots of Herods and Herodiases, etc. And then there was one more character to add to the list here, and that was Herod of Chalcis, who doesn't appear, I don't think, in the scriptures at all. Most of these are bit part players, but some of them play very important roles. But for our purposes this morning, we're just starting with the first. The father and grandfather, etc., of many of those to follow, Herod the Great. So that's who we're talking about when I say Herod this morning. Now, we won't try to untangle that kind of jumbled family tree too much more. Suffice to say, Herod at the time of Jesus' birth had been appointed by Israel by the Roman Senate about 40 BC. And he'd ruled with one or two minor hiccups early on, where he had to flee, come back, gain the approval of the new emperor and all. He reigned for more than 30 years up until his death in 4 BC. Now, of course, if you're following closely, you realize a problem with our chronology. If Jesus was born during the lifetime of Herod the Great, and Herod the Great died 4 BC, it means that Christ was born before Christ. He was probably born about 6 BC, BC being before Christ. That's really just down to a calculation error later on when people tried to kind of estimate the birth date of Jesus and obviously got it wrong by about, we think, 6 years. But anyway, good on them for having a crack at figuring that all out. Now, we saw a couple of weeks ago that Herod the Great was not only a client king of Rome, he was a massive builder of public infrastructure. Cities, palaces, fortresses. He built waterworks, a great builder of civic infrastructure. And I thought I'd pull out these very 1980s retro-looking kind of something you might see in one of those pamphlets that you get if you're walking into Wall's End Library. Anyway, some of you know what I'm talking about there. But This sort of shows you where Herod's reign by the end of his life. He was reigning over much of sort of Israel, etc. And some of the things marked on this map are things that he built, like the city of Caesarea on the sort of left-hand, on the coast there of the left-hand map. He built a big city, Sebaste, which was the capital of Samaria previously. And then in Jerusalem itself, in the right-hand map, he enlarged the second temple significantly, put a lot of money into it, rebuilt it, sometimes referred to as Herod's temple. He built a palace, magnificent palace, a fort in the north, the Antonio Fort, etc. So a big spender, and spent a lot on public infrastructure. But as well as all of this public benevolence, like many ancient kings and autocrats, unlike our kings today, it's a little bit hard to kind of get your head around today when we live in a parliamentary democracy like we do here in Australia, where we have a king, but our king's pretty much a kind of ceremonial figure in many ways, just trying to keep his head above all the scandal and controversy at the moment. But in these days, the kings had much more power and much more direct influence over everyday life. And as well as doing all of these things like good governors should do, Herod lived with some serious insecurities. Firstly, as we said 2 weeks ago, he was not of royal blood. And secondly, he was not really even of Jewish blood. His family had converted some decades earlier. And then as time went on, therefore, he became increasingly paranoid about potential rivals to the throne. Rome had agreed with him that upon his death, his sons could become his heirs. And yet Herod was so threatened by his own kids posturing and positioning themselves for power that he had both one of his wives and 3 of his oldest sons murdered in a preemptive strike, if you like. Now, if you thought the revelations in that Netflix documentary about Harry and Meghan were bad, the Windsors and Sussexes had nothing on the Herods, right? The nearer he came to dying, also, the more paranoid he became. And so, in the midst of all of that, at kind of a moment of peak paranoia, arrives a group of foreigners. Strange accents, odd-looking attire, asking about the birth of a new king. You can just imagine how it goes, right? Excuse me, king, there's some blokes from Babylon, or maybe it's now Bartholomew's, I don't know, on camels, and they're asking these questions about a new king. Well, we'll come back to that in a moment, but let's just backtrack a little bit. Who are these magi, anyway, that we see in the text? Well, Libby is probably going to talk a little bit more about these characters next week, but for now, let's just say that the magi were most likely Persian priests or court advisors who drew on a blend of astronomy and astrology, watching the movements of the planets and the stars, that kind of thing, combined with the study of ancient sacred texts to try to divine messages, heavenly messages, from which they would then advise their rulers. So they'd watch for portents in the sky of whether this battle should be fought or not fought, and whether there was a change coming, and so on. And they had come to Jerusalem because they've witnessed an astronomical phenomena, a new star, which they interpret as a divine sign that a new king has been born. Now, of course, in these days, you can't kind of Google new Jewish king or watch, the 24/7 news cycle to kind of find out whether that really happened or not, or whether you're just kind of guessing. So they had to load up their camels and pack their iPads for the long camel ride for the kids, and trek off through to the west to find out themselves. Finally, they arrive in Jerusalem. Now, remember again that in this context, of course, in the ancient Near East, the birth of a king was a momentous occasion. It would be celebrated with festivities for weeks. But imagine you're the Magi. You've journeyed for days or weeks, maybe even months, and you finally arrive expecting these kind of lingering citywide celebrations, only to find nothing. No one seems to be celebratory at all. No signs of anything out of the ordinary. Everyone's got their head down, just business as usual. Now, you'd probably be scratching your head thinking, did we get this all wrong? But you're like, no, we saw it and we knew what it meant. So you go to the palace. Surely here at least they'll still be celebrating. Nothing. So you begin to ask, where's the one who's been born to the King of the Jews? We saw his star and we've come to worship him. Awkward silence. Crickets. Which Jewish king was that you're looking for? So, of course, they ask, Herod. Surely must be Herod's heir, Herod's son. And being the secure leader that he is, with high EQ and social empathy, who seeks to empower others, Herod immediately recognizes a threat to his own power and position. And he was, the Bible puts it, disturbed all Jerusalem with him. Here are these sort of foreign court advisors come to pay homage to a new king, except there's no new king. Now, actually, the word disturbed here doesn't really capture the force of the Greek text. In the Greek, the underlying word for disturbed there means to cause great distress, to cause great turmoil, trouble. It's sometimes used in relation to causing a riot. Think of Paul and Ephesus and things, the riot that starts up, or great confusion. And so this inquiry, the arrival of these magi, caused this turmoil and distress. So when he had called, he's trying to figure this all out, when he'd called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. He calls all the resident Bible scholars and theologians, says, come on, you guys are the expert. Where's the Messiah to be born? And they reply with a quote from the prophet Micah, as you'd hope a good Bible scholar would do. They go to the scriptures and they say, well, actually, it says here in Micah, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, the city of David, where David himself had been born, as we see in 1 Samuel. So they say, in Bethlehem, for it is written, etc., etc. Now, don't miss a little detail here, because it's critical to what is going on. The Magi didn't mention anything about a Messiah. They just said, where's the King of the Jews? It's Herod who interprets their inquiry as being about not just any king of the Jews, but as God's great, final king of the Jews. Why does that matter, that little detail? Well, the word Messiah means anointed king. The problem is, Herod knows that he's an appointed king, not an anointed king. Appointed by Rome, not anointed by God. Herod realizes that the Messiah, God's anointed one, must have come. The fact that these astrologers from faraway lands had seen this great sign in the sky, he understood as having great significance. Herod believes, we might even say, that the Messiah has come. The question is, will he become a follower? See, you can be a believer in Jesus and not be a follower of Jesus. Will this king, appointed in Rome, bow his knee to the high king appointed in heaven? It's his crisis of decision. Well, what about you and I? Because you can be a believer in Jesus without being a follower of King Jesus. Without submitting and without surrendering. Herod's a believer, but in that moment of decision about whether his belief will become a following faith, Herod chooses self-interest over self-surrender. He chooses power over submission. And that decision has tragic consequences. Herod then called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He's trying to calculate when this so-called king might have been born, the Messiah. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report back to me, and so I may too go and worship him," because he pretends that he will welcome this king. But even though he believes this newborn baby may well be the Messiah, he would rather seek to destroy God's anointed one than give up his own throne and dynasty. So Herod again succumbs to a pattern of paranoid behavior common to megalomaniacs the world over then and now. And he does what dictators do. He sends his henchmen to slaughter the rival to his throne. When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious because they go home by a different route, right? And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. He wasn't taking any chances, in accordance with the time that he'd learned of the birth from the Magi. So he chooses this brutal slaughter to protect his own power. Now, we're not sure exactly, but if the population of Bethlehem was 1,000 people or less at the time, our best estimate is that probably 20 to 25 babies and toddlers were killed in what is often referred to as the slaughter of the innocents. But let me just sidebar this for a moment. The Bible doesn't sidestep senseless suffering. Right here, just a few lines after the birth of the one who would bring justice and peace on earth, or the one who will bring justice and peace on earth, we read of violence against innocent bystanders, innocent children no less. There is a breathtaking realism in the Bible about life in a fallen world. And this realism prepares us for the fact that we also live in a world where young police officers at the beginning of their career are killed at the hands of people who've fallen deeply prey to weird and wonderful and even religious conspiracy theories. It prepares us for the fact that tyrants still invade neighboring nations and then ruthlessly destroy the civil infrastructure that helps keep children, the elderly, and others warm through a bitter winter. Even the birth of the Prince of Peace was surrounded by ruthless violence visited upon the vulnerable. As Andy Stanley from North Point Church in the US points out, bad things have been happening to good people, innocent people, for a very long time. Ever since sin entered the world, our faith, our Christian faith, does not require us, he says, to look away from cruelty, injustice, and suffering. It is part of the story. It is baked into the story. It is woven, he says, into the fabric of the story from the very beginning. As we say, he says, at the end of the earthly life of Jesus, the worst possible thing happened to the best possible person. In fact, not only do we not have to look away, as Jesus followers, we are required to look at the cruelty and the injustice and the suffering in the world, because it is a reminder to us of why God sent his Son and why he didn't just send a Savior from sin, he sent a King to lead us and to instruct us in a different way of living. It is the reason, he says, that we have Christmas. So there we have it. Two kings, one human, a paranoid ruler who resorts to ruthlessness to secure his own rule, and another who would, in years to come, refuse to take up a sword, but rather would lay down his life and succumb to violence so as to overcome it and extinguish its power. Now, we've not seen the final consummation of all of that. We live in the now, but the not yet. In a world filled still with the brutal reality of violence around us. And not just overt violence, but covert violence, domestic violence, various forms of emotional and other forms of abuse, coercion, and so on. That is still our reality. But what we have with the first coming of Jesus is an anticipation of the final coming of Jesus, when once and for all forms of violence, overt, covert, physical, emotional, sexual, psychological, all forms of violence will end. Two different kings representing two entirely different kingdoms. Kingdoms of this world, which all too often become kingdoms for the rulers, not kingdoms for the ruled. And secondly, the kingdom of God, a kingdom not of this world, but a kingdom for this world. And also, we find ourselves here in this passage with two different welcomes to the true and final King. One who should have welcomed and even believed that this King was the promised and prophesied Messiah, but who instead refused to welcome and follow Jesus, because that would have involved laying down his own autocratic autonomy. And then a second welcome. A welcome by a group that shouldn't have been there. A group that you wouldn't have expected to show up to worship the newborn King. A group from a different religious tradition altogether. A group from a different country, a different ethnos, a different nation, a different culture. People who practice astrology and yet found through it that God himself was directing them to the true King. After they heard the king, that's Herod, they went on their way, and the star which they'd seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Contrast that to Herod, furious, overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. It must have been a bit confusing. There was no palatial splendor. There was no glory. There was a young mum with a young boy, and yet they knew. They bowed down, the text says, and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Well, let's wrap all this up with a question for each of us. Which are you? Which welcome will you and I offer the come and coming King this Christmas? Herod shows us that you can believe in Jesus and still not submit to him as the King of your life. You can even accept Jesus as Savior and still not yield to him as King. Like Herod, you and I can choose the path of wanting the benefits without wanting to surrender to him our autonomy, our will, our wallet, our anger at life, our desire for vengeance, our political allegiance, our time, our commitment, our all. We can want therapeutic Christianity. It's all about the benefits I get. We can want consumer Christianity, where we get to pick and choose what we like and what we don't like. Or we can choose biblical Christianity seen in the Christmas story. You can be a believer, but not a follower? Which will you be? Alternatively, you might be here today and you've never considered yourself a Christian. You might have been from a different religious background altogether, or no religious background. You might have been dragged here by family or friends. You might used to have believed but given up on it many years or months ago. Maybe you regard yourself as spiritual but not religious. And yet, this story invites you in as well. Perhaps like the Magi, you find yourself willing to welcome Jesus in a way that others, even religious people, don't always seem to have done. Perhaps you find yourself at a crossroads where you're tired of living under your own rule and reign, like our current society tells us about this sort of individualism and autonomy and choosing my best life. Maybe you've tried that a while and just found it not thirst quenching, but more like drinking a cup full of dry sand. Maybe you're ready to try living under someone else's good and gracious and loving rule. Well, either way, today might be a moment of decision. Will we choose Herod's pathway and double down, or will we take the path of the Magi, the path of joyful welcome and honour of the High King of heaven? By the way, within 2 years, King Herod was dead. 2,000 years later, King Jesus is still alive. And he's inviting us into a kingdom which knows no end. We're nearly at the end, so let me just return to the beginning. There's an old story that did the rounds when I was a young warthog. It's fictional, but it goes like this. A rough sleeper turns up at church one morning. His clothes are ragged, he hasn't washed in a while, he swears a little, and he certainly doesn't behave like good churchgoers should. He shuffles into the church, he sits down, finds all eyes are on him. This is sounding familiar. People shift nervously in their seats, and you can kind of feel the awkwardness of unwelcome in the air. This happens a few weeks in a row, and eventually the smell and the behaviour and the dishevelled appearance are too much. So some of the deacons from the church ask if he'd mind coming back when he's, tidied up and had a shower and stopped swearing and is able to fit in a little bit better. Well, feeling that sharp sting of rejection, he's sitting on the front steps of the church, tears welling up in his eyes. And then Jesus shows up. As I say, this is fictional. It's not in the Bible, but it makes a point. Just go with me, all right, on this. And he says to this guy, he says, "What's wrong?" And the rough sleeper replies, "They told me I'm not welcome in church here." To which Jesus replies, "It's okay, brother. I haven't been welcome in that church for years." Okay, it's fictional, but it's a parable. There we go. Jesus didn't tell that story, but he did say this: "Whoever welcomes a little one like this in my name welcomes me." And in context, Jesus might be talking about children, but there's a sense in which that includes all of those who are looked down on by the world, the little ones in the eyes of the world. So, how can we put this into practice? I have 3 challenges for each of us, myself included, this morning. Firstly, will you welcome Jesus as your King? Maybe you've done it before. Maybe this Christmas is time to do it again. Maybe you've been grabbing back some of that autonomy over things in your life. Maybe you've been influenced by the culture in which we live that tells us every day that we should be in charge of our own lives. We shouldn't submit to anyone else. Submission is a bad word. But maybe you found that hasn't gone so well. Maybe it's time. Or maybe it's your first time to even consider this. Maybe it's all weird and new, but there's something stirring in you that you think, I don't know what this is all about exactly. I don't even really know who this God and Jesus and how that fits together, but something's stirring in me. I think this might be a way I need to pursue, something I need to investigate further. If that's you, then let us know. Let us journey with you and explore what it means to follow Jesus. And then secondly, will you welcome him this year by welcoming others? A big thank you again to all who've given for our Joy Tree appeal, and I know some of you would love to, and you just find you in a position where you don't feel like you can, and that's okay. I understand. It's tough for many people this Christmas. But thank you anyway. If it's in your heart, thank you. But there's another way that we can welcome people, and that is to invite them to church next week. Christmas is a really good time to invite people, isn't it? People are kind of open, they're busy, but they're sort of open. Well, just this week, the National Christian Life Survey released this sort of press release that suggested that actually, it might be a little hard to read. It says, invite a friend to church this Christmas. They just might come. And they quote some of their research, which found that at least 3 in 10 Australians, more, in fact, if you include the unshores and some of those who say they don't actually know anyone who goes to church, so maybe closer to 1 in 2, but certainly 3 in 10 Australians say that they would definitely or probably say yes if invited to church. It's not a bad hit rate. And the hit rate goes up if we kind of invite in the right way. They found, NCLS found that some of the factors influencing accepting an invitation to church was first and foremost, they were more likely to come if they felt like it really meant something to the person who was asking them, a friend or a family member. So maybe just tweaking our invitation by saying, you know, it'd mean the world to me if you came along with me on Christmas to church. Maybe that might help. And then there are other factors there that we're trying to work on together as a team. But there's one problem that will be a little bit hard to see, I think, but I'll point it out to you. And that is that even though there's still this openness to attending church amongst many people, the number of churchgoers who are inviting others to church is falling. Maybe that's because we are losing confidence that they'll say yes, or that it will be a good experience for them, something like that, I don't know. But for some reason, those numbers are falling. And that brings me to my third and final challenge for us all this morning, and that is, imagine if New Vine became the most welcoming place you could visit on Christmas morning. Not in competition to other churches. I hope that everyone who turns up in any church, anywhere, gets a wonderful welcome. But churches aside, imagine if this was the place that people thought, wow, I can't believe how welcome I felt. I can't believe how welcoming people were. Imagine if New Vine became the most welcoming place around next Sunday. And also imagine with me if New Vine became the most welcoming place around every Sunday. Wouldn't that be wonderful? We're working on it, but we need to all work on it together, because welcome involves every interaction, every eye that you catch on the way in, everyone who smiles. It involves not feeling like everyone's eyes are on you in some kind of judgmental way, but everyone's eyes are on you in a welcoming way. Not that we want to kind of overwhelm people, particularly introverts who are kind of like looking for the back pew. But if we are genuine, authentically welcoming, wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, what would we need to do differently for that to happen? And what would you need to do differently to make that happen? I think back to that experience that Louise and I and our girls had all those Christmases ago in Western Scotland, and precisely because of how awkward and unwelcome we felt, I am inspired to make New Vine the most welcoming place it can possibly be, a place that literally wows people with our welcome and that makes them want to come back again and again and again long after Christmas is over. Because in welcoming other people, normal, unimportant, insignificant little people, we just might also welcome the High King of Heaven. As the band comes up, let me pray. Lord, those of us who aspire and claim to be not just believers but followers of the King, we recommit ourselves to being exactly that, to welcoming you into our midst here on Sunday mornings, to welcome you into our homes, to welcoming you into our decisions, into our families, into our workplaces, our study places. Even if it's just one of us there that we know to be followers of Jesus, help us to be mindful that you are the King of that place too. But that you are the King of a very different kingdom. And would you continue to convert us, not in the way we might think, but in the way of converting our thinking, converting us away from thinking like the cultural swamp that we live in, the kingdoms of this world that we live in, the corporate kingdoms, the political kingdoms, sometimes the familial kingdoms. Convert us out of those ways of thinking to think more and more in accordance with the way that you rule and reign. Not wielding violence, but overcoming it with an insurmountable love. And as we want to welcome you, prompt us this week to do so in part at least by welcoming others. And not just the high and mighty, but the lowly and meek. Our next door neighbours, the people on the outer at our school or our workplace. Help us find ways to welcome them and invite them. And would you give us the courage to invite people along here into this space? Courage, but also confidence. Confidence that you can meet them here, that you can encounter them in this place in a powerful, life-changing, transformative way. Maybe not the first week, but maybe the next week or the week after that. That you don't coerce people, but you welcome them in, you invite them in, you help them go on a journey, you help them work through their doubts and questions. So give us that courage, but also that confidence to invite people into this space where they might experience the wonder of your rule and reign. We pray all this in the mighty but humble, in the great and glorious name of Jesus, our King. Amen.